Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, let's get started. So, yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel hosted by the Dadley Institute at York University. I'd like to start with a short land acknowledgement. So, York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are now located, and those relationships precede the establishment of York University. So this is just kind of a quick moment to reflect on those relationships and recognize that for those of us who are here in York campus, but also there might be those types of relationships in the places where you are now. Okay, so we're I'm very, very excited to have our three panelists today with us. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction of our panelists for everyone to get to know them a bit more. So we have Evelyn right here next to me. Evelyn Amponsah is an interdisciplinary scholar of Black diaspora, memory, temporality, and political life, whose work spans Canada, Ghana, and the broader Black Atlantic. She holds a PhD in social and political thought from York and recently completed a postdoc in the Climate and Equity Lab here at York University. We also have with us Patricio Beloa. I always struggle with your surname, Patricio, sorry. And Patricio is actually joining us from Chile, from the Universidad Austral de Chile in Valdivia. Patricio is an assistant professor there at the Institute of Economics, and his research and practice explore how environmental, energy, and climate policy and action can concurrently promote community development through meaningful engagement and knowledge co-production. He holds a PhD and an MSc in public policy from the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And last but not least, we have Milene Riva. She's an associate professor at the Department of Geography at McGill University, where she holds a Canada Research Chair in Housing, Community, and Health. Milene's research is interdisciplinary and applied and sits at the intersection of health geography and population health, with a particular focus on how housing and community environments shape health and well-being across diverse populations and settings. So as you can see, there's many points of intersection between our different speakers' areas of research, but so we'll see. The idea today is to explore those points of intersections, but also see how those different perspectives complement each other. Okay, so our plan for today is we're going to start with a presentation by each one of the speakers, and then we'll have a bit of a session thinking about the future and how we can tackle these interlocking problems, and then we'll have kind of some reactions. Speakers will react to each other's contributions, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So anyway, that's more than enough from me. We'll pass it on to our speakers now. Evelyn, if you'd like to start, please.
Sure. Thank you so much, Lena. And thank you for the invite to be on this panel and to have this be a part of this conversation. I've worked with Lena over the past year, and it's been wonderful. Just a great person to think with and work with. So I'm just thankful to be here and part of this conversation. So I've just written my remarks, so I'm going to be reading them, but I might also kind of go off script. And Lena, you just keep time for me.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm calling my remarks "Spatial Contracts, Well-Being, and Care in a Climate Changed World." When we think about contract theory, we often imagine a foundational agreement, an agreement between individuals and the state, an agreement that promises protection, security, and the conditions necessary for freedom. In its classical form, just in its basic form, the social contract tells us that we give up certain freedoms in exchange for collective protection. The state, in turn, assumes responsibility for safeguarding life and well-being. But historically, we know that social contracts have never been neutral. They are political. They have always included some fully and others partially. Some are protected subjects of that contract. Others are governed by it, but not fully secured. So what I want to really suggest today is that contracts are not only legal or philosophical, they are spatial. And I think about space because I've done a lot of work in relation to housing, and just realizing that where people live has a really big impact on how they are protected. And so when I say that spatial contracts are not only legal or philosophical, they are spatial, the question I'm really dealing with is, what obligations does the state assume towards you based off of where you live? Because protection is geographically distributed. And so with even starting off with a land acknowledgement, I think that really speaks to this question of what does land mean and what do protections look like based off of where we live. So protection is geographically distributed. If you live in certain neighborhoods, infrastructure anticipates your safety. Whether it's a stop sign or a stoplight, buildings are insulated, schools are cooled, drainage systems are maintained, climate risk is already buffered. If you live elsewhere, protection becomes conditional, deferred, or individualized. So when we talk about climate change, we are also talking about the spatial distribution of well-being. In the work that I was doing in the postdoc, we did some research around Toronto, Vancouver, and Kitchener, and we were able to think about residents who live in social housing towers, single-room occupancies, and basement apartments. In Vancouver, in I think the heat wave in the early 2020s, there were a lot of deaths that were associated with people who were living in single-room occupancies. Basement apartments are often precarious spaces, and social housing towers have a history of harm towards the residents that live in them. These are spaces where climate impacts are not rare events. They are reoccurring stressors layered into existing precarity. During extreme heat events, indoor temperatures in high-rise towers can exceed safe thresholds for days. Residents describe sleeping near the doorways to catch air circulation. Most of the times, the hallways or the common areas are air-conditioned, while residents' units are not set up to actually maintain cooling air, etc. Parents describe children waking up already exhausted, and so you're not really sleeping, you're just tossing and turning. Elders report worsening respiratory symptoms. In some under-resourced schools without adequate cooling, students are rotated throughout the library because it is the only air-conditioned room in the building. Entire classes take turns occupying that cooled space. I'm actually working on a project right now where we're looking at literacy and climate change, and we were talking to some of the children, and that's what they were telling us. We have one cooling center, and it's not even a cooling center, it's the library or a common space, and then they get to take turns going through that space. So learning becomes fragmented. Instruction adapts around heat rather than around pedagogy. From the outside, that might look like resilience, but from the perspective of spatial contracts, it signals something else. It signals that some educational spaces were never fully climate secured. Extreme cold reveals similar fractures. Families facing energy poverty sometimes ration heat. Children sleep in colder rooms, concentration declines. Again, from that research, there's a lot of data that points to how the cold impacts like your cognitive ability and your ability to retain information. Illness spreads more easily in poorly ventilated buildings. Some classrooms fluctuate between too cold and too hot because aging systems cannot regulate consistently. And these conditions are not minor inconveniences. They affect cognition. Heat impairs working memory and sustained attention. Chronic cold stress affects focus and physical comfort. Sleeping disruption alters emotional regulation. This is where my work on literacy intersects directly with climate and energy poverty. Through the study that we're doing, I did another study that was looking at the reading journeys of Black children in Canada. We see clearly that literacy development depends on environmental stability. Reading requires sleep, light, quiet, cognitive bandwidth, emotional safety. When a child is sleeping in an overheated unit, when a family is anxious about a hydro bill, when a basement floods and housing becomes unstable, these conditions do not stay outside the classroom, they travel with the child. Funny enough, there was a father who was just talking about trying to teach his daughter to read and how her hands were just always cold and she just couldn't focus and was really struggling with reading because of this. So spatial contracts do not determine who is comfortable. They shape whose cognitive development is buffered and whose is strained. If certain neighborhoods constantly experience underinvestment in climate-resilient housing and school infrastructure, then the social contract is not merely abstractly unequal, it is intergenerationally unequal. And this is what brings me to care. Because when spatial contracts fail to guarantee protection through infrastructure, care does not disappear, it just shifts location. During heat waves, neighbors check on elders, parents share fans, community organizations open cooling spaces beyond their mandates. During extreme cold, informal coat drives emerge, teachers adjust lesson plans, staff rotate students through cooled rooms, families coordinate childcare during storms. Care is happening everywhere. But the core tension is that communities are already doing the work of care and systems benefit from this care. But systems are not structured to reciprocate care. And when systems say they don't care about us, they are not talking about the emotion of care. Sorry, when communities say they don't care about us, they're not talking about the emotion of care, they're saying they're not doing their job. The system is not doing its job. When government assumes communities will figure it out, care becomes extracted, burnout becomes normalized, relational labor becomes invisible. Women, Black and Indigenous communities, migrants disproportionately absorb the cost of keeping others safe. Under unequal spatial contracts, care becomes privatized. And when care is privatized, inequity deepens. So one of the shifts I'm arguing for is we must stop treating care as an emotion and start treating care as infrastructure. Care is not softness, it's risk management. It reduces hospitalizations during heat waves. It stabilizes children's cognitive environment. It reduces crisis costs. It builds institutional trust. If we treated care as an infrastructure, we would ask different policy questions. Does this housing retrofit reduce the care burden on families? Does this climate adaptation plan stabilize educational environments? Does this energy program protect cognitive well-being, not just kilowatt hours? We would evaluate climate policy not only by emissions reduced, but by well-being stabilized. But the barriers are structural. Housing markets are financialized. Buildings are assets before they are homes. Energy systems are often structured around revenue recovery rather than universal access. Climate funding is short-term and siloed. Education policy rarely integrates environmental stress into its metrics. Spatial contracts are politically produced, which means they can be politically negotiated. And there are many openings across political divides. There's a broad resonance around protecting children, elders, and keeping people safely housed. When we frame climate justice as protecting the conditions necessary for children to sleep, read, and learn, the conversation shifts. Because ultimately the question is not whether communities care, they obviously do. The question is whether systems are structured to care too, and how do we shift that burden of care? If contract theory asks who is protected and who is obligated, then spatial contracts ask whose well-being is guaranteed by infrastructure and who is left to their neighbors. Climate change is revealing that for many communities, care is improvised rather than embedded. And so the work ahead, and maybe part of this conversation, is not simply to just add more care, but it's to think about how to redesign systems so that care is reciprocal, structural, and spatially just. And so I'll leave it there for now and hope to have more conversation about my comments and others on the panel.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. And that was, you kept perfectly to time. So
perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, great. Can we hear from Patricio now? Please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Lina, and thank you, Evelyn, for your presentation. There's so many points that connect to my work and also to other work I've done around, the same issue. I'm going to share my screen first, and I'll continue. Give me a second. Oops, here it is. Okay, and now please let me know if it looks fine or you can see. It's fine?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lina. Thank you, Natalie. Thanks, everyone. My name is Patricio Veloa, and I'm here, in Valdivia, in Chile, Southern Hemisphere. I work here at the Universidad Austral, and I'm going to talk about my research for my doctoral dissertation. I did a couple years ago, actually more than a couple, but I still think fits well with the event today. I looked at climate resilience in gentrifying communities, especially in one called East Boston. If anyone has been in Boston before, it's the neighborhood where the airport is, which is very centrally located in the city, and it's a neighborhood that is majority Latino population still. As you can see in my first slide, I did not go into graphic design. I went into economics and other things. So apologies, right, for my very not advanced slides. Main problem, you know it, right? It's what is expected, especially in the U.S. Northeast, because of the influence of Greenland and others, right? It is expected for the water to rise a bit more quickly than in other places. But the issue here, especially in my research, is that climate resilience policy started to interact with other structural problems, as Evelyn was commenting, right, that we already have in our societies. So it's not that climate change arrived and then suddenly education, poverty, discrimination, lacks of opportunities vanished. No, you have to, interact with all the existing problems. So the focus of climate resilience policy matters a lot. That's a photo of East Boston in sometimes when the sea likes to go up. This is quickly East Boston. You can see that is the Latino population is almost half of the around 50,000 people living there. It has been like that since the 90s and 2000s, but in the last 10 to 15 years, things started to change. This neighborhood is in the waterfront in the Boston Harbor, meaning it became very attractive, for new development to start. So new development started arising in the areas of the old factories that existed in East Boston, the brownfields. And while people was asking for more parks, more schools, and more housing for those who already were living there, the city decided, right, to use this area in front of the harbor that previously was locked from the people to build high-end housing or even luxury housing. What is happening now? People is mobilizing. People is realizing that the neighborhood is changing. It became, in a very short period of time, from a working class neighborhood into a attempting luxury neighborhood. But that's not the only problem that is happening, the rapid gentrification. It is also the most vulnerable neighborhood to climate change in the whole greater Boston area. And the neighborhood, in case of inaction, it is supposed to be flooded in not that many years. So, of course, something had to be done. And that first thing that was done was Climate Ready Boston, a big, climate resilience plan. What is the vision? Because this is not, really a plan. It doesn't have activities or anything, but it has a vision. And the vision of the Climate Ready Boston is that the whole waterfront has to be elevated, has to be improved, so the neighborhood can be protected. Evelyn was mentioning that protection is geographically distributed, right? Isabel Angelovsky, who's probably one of the persons who has studied more, the issue of gentrification and climate change from the Universidad Autónoma of Barcelona, differentiates between two types of sins regarding this lack of protection. The first is the sin of omission, that probably is closer to what Evelyn was mentioning, meaning you don't protect people who you don't consider deserving or wealthy enough for their property to be protected. But there are also sins of commission, according to her, which is you try to protect population that might be marginalized, but by protecting them, you might be causing other problems in the future. This is what is happening here. All this waterfront that you are seeing here that is being redeveloped, almost completely redeveloped, is causing a problem or is exacerbating some problems that the neighborhood already had, such as affordability, of course, gentrification that comes with it, lacks of opportunity, lack of identity or losing the identity, and other issues I can talk about. So basically, my research was about also examining how is Boston people through the Latinx activists who were the group that I worked closely, were experiencing this relationship or this intersecting problem of gentrification and climate change, and what are their strategies and how do they feel that the official strategies were working. I'm gonna go fast through here. I did, of course, it was a qualitative approach. I did 20-something interviews, but considering the two other reports I have are over 50 interviews. But I also did something called the Fundamental Human Needs Workshop, because that was my approach, something that we share with Lina, that we work. So I did a couple of sessions with Latinx activists or people who were active, in their neighborhood, in which we finally developed 3 matrices of first the negative issues that they could recognize, also the positive in the name of their assets, issues that they can see in the neighborhood, what is still doing well, and also how is that they would love to see their neighborhood developing, like probably not in the same way it's developing now. So that could also give me a more ample understanding on how is their lived experience regarding, gentrification and climate change. I also had spent 4 months doing some participant observation in something called the Green Walks that I'm going to talk about it a bit later. Super fast. My findings regarding the impacts, I'm not gonna go deep on them now, but I'll talk a bit of the interacting crisis and a community in action later. What I saw, right, is that people are seeing that climate change provided like a reason for more waterfront development, meaning we need to protect the neighborhood. Who can do it? New development or developers. If you want to build your luxury building here, great, but please elevate us and protect us. They said, great, okay, we can do that. So people started having a negative perception about some resilience measures, including this one. So as resilience in the understanding of activists started reinforcing gentrification, the whole climate resilience effort started being seen as something undesirable. You're seeing here a photo that I took on a new building that's elevated. You are safe here. It's also luxury. And it's right in the same neighborhood where the Latinx people with, of course, lower average income than all of the city of Boston is living in. The displacement is increasing at a very, very fast pace too. Some activists see a sweet spot in which you could actually do better by embracing climate gentrification, but those are actually not that many. So activists see, right, that resiliency may contribute to gentrification because it's making the neighborhood more desirable, more attractive. And unfortunately, it became something today as an identity of gentrification, and they see of who to blame here, and they blame the city. Why? Because they say that the city is achieving 3 things. First, more housing. People is complaining that, of course, there's an affordability crisis. How do you fix that? More housing. Okay, then you have more housing. 13% has to be affordable. Not that much, More revenue because of more of the tax base. And also, climate resilience is being paid by privates and not by the people. So that means, right, that is a triple win for the city. Some more connected activists, right, or more experienced, see the opportunity to build power, but not many people actually, or not all of them. And others look with distrust some of the actions already taken by the city. I think I'm going to get until here. How am I on time, Lina?
You have just over a minute left.
Okay, so I'm just gonna say, right, that some of the activists are starting to create their own strategies to tackle this. Although this goes more into a part of solutions, I wanna say it because, for example, the green works are more of an organically developed approach to climate change, not a top-down, imposed plan from the city, and those are, instances where people gather their talk about how they are experiencing climate change and gentrification and affordability and discrimination and all of that, and started all together creating small strategies that may be more useful than a single plan that has come from the mighty city of Boston. In this moment, and still the activists are struggling between joining longer organizations of activists fighting climate change and incorporating their own issues and their own problems into that, or starting to build power from within and try to create new organizations that can genuinely address more intersecting issues and not only climate resilience understood as only the built environment. I'll stop there and then later we can continue. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you, Patricio. Really interesting stuff. And yeah, please, Milen, do you want to take it away?
Yes. All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you also see my screen? Hold on.
Yes,
oh,
but
it's coming. Yeah, it's coming. Is this working?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Perfect. All right. So thank you again for the invitation. Milen Riva, joining you from Chanchake, also known as Montreal. A lot of the work that we do in my research group is positioning energy and housing as determinants of health. And we conduct projects around energy precarity in Nova Scotia, in Quebec, but also across the country. So I prepared a few slides that just traces a broad overview as to why we're doing this type of work. So I'm based in a geography department, but I was also trained in public health. So over my career, I've held joint appointments in both public health and in geography, or distinct appointment in geography or public health. In public health, we see health as connected to everything. And this everything is, we refer to the social determinants of health, the conditions in which we live, in which we are born, we grow up, we age, and we die. And thinking about the social determinants of health and connecting them to the Sustainable Development Goals. Really, all the Sustainable Development Goals relate to good health and to well-being. Energy and health are really connected. Energy is essential for meeting our basic needs. It's a prerequisite for good health. The World Health Organization, the WHO, recognizes energy use as an important public health concern. And in their housing and health guideline, or healthy housing and health guideline, they identify thermal comfort of housing as two key factors to pay attention to when we are looking at housing as a determinant of health. And access to clean, sustainable, and affordable energy plays a crucial role in advancing health in Canada, but also across the world. So Evelyn spoke about energy precarity or energy poverty. Energy precarity happens when households cannot access or afford enough energy services at home to meet their needs, to maintain healthy indoor temperatures, and to live with dignity. So energy services is what services energy provide. It's heating, cooling in the summer, lighting, using appliances, communicating with others, connecting for work, or learning. And in Canada, depending on how we measure energy poverty, It's anywhere between 6 to almost 20% of households that may be facing energy precarity. And you see that it varies at the very local scale. So some communities are facing much greater energy hardship than others. So why do we pay attention to energy poverty in my research group? Well, first and foremost, there's very strong connections with health and well-being. Energy poverty or energy precarity means living in homes that are too cold or too hot, where people have to juggle bills to pay their utilities, when they have to choose between putting food on the table or paying utility bills. It has an impact on chronic disease. It can exacerbate certain chronic conditions. It has an impact on sleep. Evelyn made some connections with literacy, so that's an important one to consider. Can lead to social isolation and overall creates very stressful living circumstances. So not everyone is exposed to energy precarity, nor will see the same impacts. So studies have showed that women, Black, Indigenous, and people of colors are more likely to be exposed to energy poverty, people living with chronic disease, with disabilities, single parents, people living alone, people with lower household income are all more likely to face energy poverty. And this creates, deeply entrenched equity and justice issues when we think about Canada being, one of the leading world power in terms of energy production, including renewables. It also raises equity and justice questions when we think about some of the programs, such as home energy upgrades that could be implemented to curb energy precarity, and whether or not these programs really meet the need of the people that would benefit the most from these programs. And of course, thinking about climate change and the intersection with energy precarity, flooding, heat waves, wildfires, in ice storms like we have in Quebec and elsewhere across Canada. So these extreme weather events can increase the needs of household in terms of energy consumption, but can also compromise access to energy for days at a time. So there's a close connection between housing and health. This is a figure that's adapted from a paper that Lauriane Debane has written. Lauriane is a PhD candidate working with me. She's also connected to the call. So just recognizing how energy and the different dimension of housing intersect, around the cost, the condition, the stability of housing, the ontological security that a home should be providing. So a home is more than four walls and a roof. The importance of energy and housing for care and relation, and the context, so the wider environments in which the home is located. So I did not consult with Evelyn in preparing the slides, but it's interesting to see that care comes up in our discussion. So a study we conducted in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. So Lauriane Debane did interview with over 30 households, 30 people facing energy poverty or housing instability and homelessness in and around Bridgewater. And that's pushed us to really integrate care in how we think about this interconnection between housing and home. Caring needs and responsibilities will impact energy use and cost. People that are living with certain chronic conditions or disability have higher energy needs, and the ability to care and be cared for can be compromised by energy precarity. So here, just to share some some stories that participants who are parents shared with us, struggling to hold their baby because of joint pain when the dwelling is too cold, struggling to sleep because of the fear that space heaters in children's home might catch on fire, feeling inadequate of being unable to provide a warm home for their child. And of course, when energy precarity and substandard housing condition coexist during extreme weather event, well, these vulnerabilities can be exacerbated. So we didn't plan for this, but when Lorianne traveled to Bridgewater to conduct interviews, she flew in right before Hurricane Lee happened. So there was a lot of fear and stories that were shared with us around losing power. And as Gwen, fictional name, explained during the interview, that she chose not to sleep for a few days at a time, just in case she could keep an eye on her mom, who relied on an oxygen tank for breathing. As I mentioned, different solutions that are being deployed across the country to improve home energy upgrades. They're often evaluated for reduced energy consumption, not necessarily for non-energy benefits that relates to improve well-being, improve thermal comfort. And I just wanted to flag, some of the intersections around housing, energy, and health that we see across the country in First Nations, in Inuit communities, in the Arctic, and in large urban settings. I'll stop here.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Mylène. This has been a very well-behaved panel in terms of keeping time. I thank you very much, all, for that. So kind of the way that we organized the panel was to talk about sort of, this section was about sort of the present, kind of describing the conditions of how things are right now in the different studies that you've all done. But now I'd like to spend, another 15 minutes getting your reflections on the future, right? Getting your ideas of how can we actually tackle both climate change and your area of expertise, so issues around energy policy, gentrification, housing, in an equitable way, right? And how what do you see as the main barriers for change? This is just kind of to get your reflections, really, in terms of that more forward-looking question. So we'll keep the same order. Evelyn, do you want to go first?
Sure, for sure. I feel like there was so many intersections and so many connections between all of the different, between our conversations, and my interdisciplinary brain is going in so many different directions around solutions and trying to think through that. And one of the things I think, just in terms of thinking about health and the impact and the connection between health and the conversation that we're having, one of the challenges for me is that I think a lot of when we're talking about climate, it's not being discussed in terms of this a very interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary kind of conversation. And so the measures for the challenges around climate then are very specific and don't necessarily overlap in terms of these other areas. And sorry, I know that I'm just thinking about myself and thinking about the fact that I'm always cold. Right, and one of the things around me being always cold is that my iron is low, and so when we think about the fact that Black women, Black people tend to have higher levels of being anemic, and that kind of question, and then thinking about the more extreme cold events that we're having, and then when I think about solutions, and actually I think they're still on the call, but a couple of friends who are NPs, and they were able to talk to me about just this connection around the Black woman and iron and having lower levels of iron and therefore being anemic, and then thinking about, okay, what are solutions around that, taking iron pills and those kinds of things. So the reason I just bring this up is because I started finding solutions towards being hot or being cold in areas where when I'm looking at climate research, I'm not seeing that connection. I'm not seeing those types of solutions, so that it's not always about the kinds of extractive processes, we need more housing, or we need more insulation, or we need other things. If we're able to sort of have these interdisciplinary conversations, then you just get to see that there are so many more possibilities that are just around us in terms of our ability to solve these problems. And so luckily I was able to get an iron infusion, and now I feel much less cold than I used to. And so even if in my home I'm not able to control, for example, my energy costs, there was something else that I could do that became useful, that helped me out. And so I started trying to sort of like think about that in terms of, I wouldn't call it like a grassroots, but just when our focus becomes around these systems and how are we going to get these larger systems to change, when there are these other types of solutions that can be implemented on smaller scales, that can then be scaled up, that then don't necessarily have to do with the way that we are, like the system won't change, or we can't do X, Y, and Z. So I think those are some of the pieces that I was thinking about. And then even thinking about like the housing crises that we tend to raise. And I think it was Patricio who mentioned just building more housing. If you look at a place like Toronto, where there are a lot of empty units, but then the solution around people being underhoused is that we need more housing. But we also know we have a lot of empty units just around the city. And, I think people are seeing all of this stuff around the condo crisis and people trying to sell their condos, and a lot of these condos are just sitting empty. And so when I think about the future, I wonder what that mapping looks like around solutions that don't necessarily have to do with recreating or making new things or starting new things or more extractive, but rather when we bring interdisciplinary people to the table to think about what is the core of the problem and what are the alternative ways in which we can try to solve them. And yeah, so those are some of the pieces that I was thinking about. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Evelyn. Patricio, what are your thoughts on the future?
Yeah, I'm gonna quickly share screen again just to show the analysis I made with that. Sorry, you can see my slide, right? I will never trust this thing. That's why I will always ask. Basically, the proposal would be a change in focus, right, on climate resilience, at least towards more equitable climate resilience. But how do you do that? My working assumption in this work was that a more equitable climate resilience is the one that addresses or fulfills or satisfy more human needs at the same time. For that, of course, I used a framework called Fundamental Human Needs from Manfred Max Neff, based on the work of Carlos Malman and others, that creates a more universal understanding of human needs, and that allows me also to analyze both the top-down elite-driven strategy of reinforcing, the waterfront so the water won't pass, and other strategies that are more community-driven, more organically arise. For example, in the case of the climate resiliency, the current climate resiliency policy in East Boston, or at least the one a couple of years ago, right? I can see that many, well, it might also, fulfill some needs like protection, like, the water is not entering. At the same time, happens that the same strategy impairs other fundamental human needs. In the case of protection, participation, creation, freedom, subsistence, and affections. Can be more. That analysis is more contained in my dissertation. But I also differentiate, right, when is that happening. Some of them during the process or the design, while other problems are raised after with this strategy as an outcome. While some other called eudaimonic or community-driven climate resilience from the activists, like intersectional organizing for more than one issue, right, and bringing the lived experience of those most impacted to the center. And also, I took the green walks as an example, where we're also analyzed with this lens of the fundamental human needs. who helped me and the community as well understand what they are doing, right, in terms of how they are fulfilling or satisfying their human needs through their actions. So I think exposing the difference between these two ways of trying to achieve more equity or trying to protect people, it's I think it helps, and it also helps decision makers to see a different way of analyzing solutions for a problem. In the case, of course, of policy recommendations, I have is to redefine the policy focus towards a more eudaimonic well-being or eudaimonic solutions, right, for everyone. So ideally, you would achieve this through making more place at the policymaking table for communities, including people with a different perspective of what well-being and what happiness is. Yeah, other things that are more connected to my research, right, and to that specific case in East Boston are that funding only goes beyond climate resilience infrastructure, but also go through education and also for communities to be able to keep doing what they are doing in terms of organizing, in terms of supporting their own people. That means, right, empowering grassroots groups that promote climate engagement and that can achieve also a more equitable resilience or climate justice in the long term. Thank you. Oops, sorry.
Great, Patricio. So we've heard from both you and Evelyn the importance of looking at a broader range of solutions and perhaps changing the focus of how we evaluate policy, perhaps against well-being or needs. So I'm wondering, Evelyn, Mylène, what are your thoughts in relation to this?
Well, I had made a few notes to think about the barriers for change when we're thinking about climate change and adaptation and equity with regards to housing. And the bottom-up focus is really important. Patricio ended in talking about climate justice. So climate justice or energy justice or environmental justice, paying attention to all the different principles of justice when we're developing policy, climate adaptation or energy policy. Who's going to be benefiting? Who is the policy or who is the program targeting? Whose needs are recognized? Whose voices do we hear? The interdisciplinary approach that Evelyn was speaking to is also very important. Like, we're dealing with, complex systems, and complex problems require complex solutions, and funding mechanisms for policies is siloed, right? It's ministerial policy, and then funding is tied to policies or to governments. And for me, like in housing and energy, and so in our group, we also look at the social and well-being impacts of home energy upgrades in various settings across the country. And we spoke to people organizations responsible for implementing home energy upgrades. And some of the barriers that they identify is, this lots of funding, high levels of reporting, low capacity to deliver. There's no long-lasting program or sustainable source of funding. So there's there's rapid investment, like the Build Canada Homes, which is, potentially fantastic in addressing the housing crisis in the country, but there's no time for meaningful engagement. So in the North, for example, across Arctic First Nations and Northern communities, Build Canada Homes is, reusing the same language that was used after the Second World War in building housing in the North that contribute to the long-lasting substandard housing situation that we see. So taking the time to speak with the people and to try to, to break that path dependence and to do things differently I think is a very important barriers that that need to we need to find ways to address. There's many barriers. I can go on. I'll stop here unless you have a follow-up questions.
No, that's great. Thank you, Milen. So it seems to me, kind of from the presentations and these kind of forward-looking contributions, that there's some cross-cutting themes here around the recognition of all sorts of intersecting vulnerabilities and spatial disparities. Also, looking at the issue of lack of protection being something that is politically negotiated and spatially distributed, but also that has very, very specific consequences, and therefore that lack of protection to climate impacts relates to the issue of care that came up in all of the presentations, I would say. And then in this forward-looking space, I guess one common theme that I've sort of heard from all of you was around how do we actually evaluate interventions and policy, and sort of moving towards different ways of evaluating interventions for climate resilience, for housing security, for energy poverty, that go beyond the traditional measures of perhaps related to financial measures or things around kilowatts and CO2 emissions and those sorts of things, towards measures that are more focused on health and well-being. So anyway, that's kind of what I heard. I'm wondering if either of you three want to kind of react to any of that, react to each other before we open the floor to our audience, our people who are here with us or virtually with us. So yeah, any reactions from our panelists before we open the floor? Milen, please.
Mm-hmm. I just want to, follow up on your last example on how do we evaluate programs and policies, and do we use kilowatt hours or greenhouse gas emission? So home energy retrofit programs are designed to shift from oil to heat pump, to lower greenhouse gas emission, to reduce energy use. But there's something called the Jevons paradox, the rebound effect. So when we implement new technology, sometimes we see an increase in the use of the technology and not a reduction. So when we do interviews with households, lower income households, households living in social housing that see their home energy system upgraded, they get improved insulation, new windows and new doors, we could expect lower energy use, but sometimes we see the opposite. We see greater energy use because, or it is shifted across the year. Right now, like heat pump also provide air conditioning in the summer. So a household who didn't have air conditioning in the past will rely on it in the summer. We've heard people explain to us that now when they turn the thermostat on, heating comes up, right? So they don't mind paying a little bit more and consuming more energy, because now it means that they are comfortable inside their home. So for me, this speaks to the importance of paying attention to non-energy benefits of these home energy upgrades program, understanding what happens in the house for household members. So if we stick to objective measurements like greenhouse gas emission, reduced energy consumption, we might miss really important impacts. And, energy poverty, it's associated with cardiovascular disease, with respiratory disease. There's hospitalization attached to that. So there's health benefits on the health system to be gained by improving the energy efficiency of homes, right? It's not just about reducing energy consumption.
Yeah.
I just would like to briefly build up on that, because it's at the end looking at second and third order, consequences of your policy and action. I had the chance to work briefly at the European Commission at the Unit of Adaptation in the Climate Action Ministry or department they have. Then it was 15 years ago or a bit more, and at that time they were already having the discussion and preparing for looking at these consequences of their policies. So when we, for example, think about, happens a lot in North America, right? Europeans as bureaucratic, right? And everything takes so long to be implemented. It has to be faster. The problem with going fast in this case is that you might, completely overlook all the consequences of your action and end up having these rebound effects, or even worse, right? Displacement at a large scale, because the association that any of these measures can even have with luxury or with things that many people will not even consider necessary. So yeah, I think the need is for look a bit broader. Yeah, it might take a bit more time, right, to evaluate the project and to give the go. But we are seeing the consequences today, and people might start lose confidence on the measures we are taking nowadays.
If I can add, I think one of the things that in doing this work that tends to stand out for me is sometimes we have this expectation, or that there's this assumption that the very rich or like billionaires can somehow come up with solutions for us when they've already demonstrated they don't care about human beings, and really profit is the thing that motivates the kinds of so-called solutions that they come up with. And so when a lot of the housing, climate policy, around energy and these things are connected to, for example, developers, and this assumption that somehow they're going to care, when really it's about their bottom line. So if the solution somehow fits in with their bottom line, then it's something that they're going to be open to considering. But if it becomes contradictory, then it's not on the table, I think, or there's ways around that. I think that's where I'm wondering if sometimes we're looking for solutions from the wrong people, from the wrong places. And so even whatever evaluation metrics we're giving folks, sometimes the government's giving tax kickbacks, or there's these expectations, like in Toronto, if you're building a condo, they want you to have a certain amount of green space, I think, downtown, right, like protecting parks. And they just found a way around that, which is to put the green space on top of the building, and so people can't actually access it, right? When I was working at housing, there in Lawrence Heights, where they were doing some redevelopment, they had a garage. Residents were complaining that their safety was at risk because the garage door was always open. When they raised those concerns to Toronto Community Housing, they said, well, if the garage has to open all the time, like open and close, it increases the wear and tear, which means they're going to have to replace it more often, for example, or maintain it more often. So again, the measurement is off, right? Like, people are talking about their safety of having this thing open all the time, and they're like, well, if we allow you to open and close it, we're going to have to maintain it more. And so the people that are in power, or sometimes the people who are having these expectations of their priorities, we already know their priorities are already not in line with what, or else we wouldn't be in the positions that we are already in. And so there's always this sort of like going back to thinking about where are the solutions coming from, which solutions are we trying to elevate and, put at the forefront. And can we really, I think, question our assumptions around who we're expecting to come up with these solutions? Because if it's the people that have money or have power, I'm not saying they don't have an obligation, but if the expectation is there, then I think we've already lost the conversation, because they've already demonstrated that they're not, whatever they care about is not in line with what we are caring about or what we're trying to put forth. I don't know what that means in terms of the conversation. I don't have a solution around it, but I think it's something that's important to name, around where are we looking for solutions and how can we put them forth, without assuming that this class of people who have already demonstrated that they're not interested in well-being will somehow become interested in well-being if we can just prove to them with enough data that it's important.
Yeah. Okay. All very interesting reflections. We haven't solved the issues of the world yet, so I'm going to open it to our audience, both both here in the room and virtually, to see if your questions, comments might bring us a bit closer to to some answers. Yeah. Anyone online or in the room? Godfrey, please.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So thank you for this interesting conversation on climate change, climate resilience, but also on housing and energy, precarity or poverty, or what I call insecurity, which is kind of my focus. Hearing from you, it turns that I probably have some of the ideas you have, but also wanted to contribute to the discussion. One, in looking at the future, I heard of interdisciplinarity, but I think it is going beyond that to multidisciplinarity, but also to what someone had talked about in terms of grassroots mobilization, to discuss and to uncover some of the strategies that could be used to dealing with this crisis that they are facing. And so you find that climate change or extreme weather conditions tend to kind of multiply the effects. It ends up becoming an effect multiplier for whatever conditions were there already. And so if it's poverty, it gets worse. If it is health issues, those things get worse. And so the goal of a multidisciplinary approach that engages communities, engages key stakeholders, brings us to this point of a cross-sectorial approach in dealing with this issue. For so long, it's been a lot of it has been in isolation. I mean, it's been done in silos, and so this group comes up with a strategy, that group comes up with a strategy, and we are not talking to each other. It's not in sync. And so going by that, I tend to believe we could come to the point where developers, but also the community, as well as policymakers, could come together around the same table and come up with a solution that works for all. It might not be the best for each one of them, but at the end of the day, it works in some ways to mediate some of the effects, especially at the household level. Now, a lot of the effects that have been discussed here is more of what we see in the developed world. I'm dealing with these same issues in developing countries, in a place like Kenya, in a place like Ghana, and you can see the real effects, especially in informal settlements where they live in shacks, they live in, you would not even call it house, a building. They are more or less homeless. And so the effect of extreme weather, whether it is precipitation or temperature, just compounds the whole thing. And it's all because no one, I mean, there are strategies, but it's been done in silos, and no one seems to care. It appears no one cares. Then the second thing has to do with the possible policy change in this regard. I mean, there are policies that have been put in place, and I was just trying to make reference to this recent policy change in terms that the Canada Labour Code amendments regarding occupational health and safety regulations that deals with the threshold limit values. And we recently talked about it, but what this has to do is the Canadian government has introduced a requirement within the workplaces just so that in terms of thermal stress, that is minimized, right? And it has implications. It's now a requirement for every employer. Okay. And so taking a look at that, I'm thinking if we can translate that same process to the housing, to the energy sector, then we can make a headway somewhat so that it is not a recommendation, but it's a law that you'd have to follow. And then whoever being the housing manager, whoever is in charge of energy utility would have to meet that requirement. I think for so long, a lot of it has been guidelines with no enforcement. And so if there's some enforcement, maybe.
Yeah. So Godfrey gives us a bit of a more optimistic view that we can work together with multi-sectorally. But also I don't know in the rest of Canada, I know in Ontario there's a minimum temperature bylaw. Yeah. So housing landlords have to guarantee a minimum temperature in the winter, and there's been the work of the Low-Income Energy Network in Ontario trying to establish a maximum temperature bylaw as well. So that avenue is sort of being explored. I don't know what the situation is in other provinces in Canada or in the US, but I'm thinking, shall we collect Niku's question or comment before we? Niku's and Deborah's, and then we'll answer three in one go.
And there's two in the chat now, I think.
Oh, sorry, I can't see the chat.
Deborah's going to ask her question directly,
okay.
But there's an additional one in the chat.
Okay. So, Niku, please, do you want to go ahead?
For sure. Thank you to all the panelists. There's a lot to think about here, and I really appreciate the emphasis on just like environmental and climate justice, and especially with respect to energy. I feel like not something that we hear about as much as we should. My question that kind of has more to do with sort of what you might think about or what you might see as potentially solutions as ways to democratize energy justice when based on like what I'm thinking, a lot of energy seems to be very like, or energy production and technologies around greening and mitigation of hazards of climate change and whatnot are captured by these kinds of like forces that are richer and who have the resources to be able to build that stuff or to get the oil or to create the technologies or to mobilize them at scale, which then kind of like falls into the hands of particular people who have the means to have access to them. So given this context, what do you think would be sort of a way to move towards like democratizing these kinds of solutions to mitigating harms of climate change and not having enough energy? That's my question.
Okay, great. Thank you, Niku. Deborah?
Yes, thank you all so much again. That was a very fascinating presentation. I did pop my question in the chat in case you want to take a look at it, but especially considering your point around the need to consider potential rebound effects and things like that, I was wondering if you might be able to speak to any complications or roadblocks you might have encountered when you're each conducting your own various research. So thank you again very much.
Great, thank you. And I guess let's, maybe Natalie, do you want to read the chat question?
Sure. It's from Ashley Addison. I was introduced to the term climate apartheid in Ashley Dawson's book, Extreme Cities. What do you think of this term, and how do you see this dynamic playing out in Ontario's current approach to urban planning and housing?
Okay, great. So we have four perspectives there in terms of working multi-sectorally and using legislation, in terms of democratizing solutions, in terms of what roadblocks have you found, and in terms of climate, what was it, climate apartheid, right?
Yes.
So anyone want to take any of those on?
I think I can start with the question around like the roadblocks in terms of research, because that was in doing research, especially like the qualitative, when you're talking to communities that are particularly precarious, for example, when we went to Vancouver and we were trying to get feedback and just engage with people that live in SROs, single room occupancies. In Vancouver, they had a specific program where they're moving folks that are unhoused into these SROs. And it's really hard to be asking questions around climate and the impact of climate, for example, when people when people's basic needs are at the forefront of what they are thinking about and their experience, and coming into a space with like your own research question and then trying to get people to think about that when actually they want to be talking about not having enough food or not being able to, just move around freely and some of those other things. And so what I started to really struggle with some of these ethical issues around how we're doing research and how we're trying to do qualitative research in terms of engaging communities who oftentimes have academics and or other researchers coming into their communities and asking them questions, taking away this data, writing some sort of report, and then their experience is not changing. And that continues to, I think, dehumanize populations that have already been dehumanized in so many other ways. And so I think that was like a barrier that we continue to talk about, especially with Lena, in terms of like, how do we do this research? Because you do want to understand like the impact of climate and these climate extremes and these policies, but yeah, how do you hold space for the trying to bring in these grassroots experiences and listening to people? Like, how do you do all of that without dehumanizing? And one of the things was to name people are like the dehumanization is part of the problem. The fact that we don't have solutions, we have solutions, but when people are already deemed to not be fully human and therefore their experiences are already compromised, that's already part of an experience, and you cannot leave that out of research or like your approach when you're engaging with people. And so I found that when we named that in the workshop and we talked about dehumanization, it helped, because then it's like, yeah, we can come up with all the solutions in the world, but if somebody doesn't already see you as worthy of any of these solutions, it doesn't matter if you come up with the cheapest, if it's free, whatever that solution might be, it doesn't matter if you're already dehumanized and therefore you're not worthy of well-being, you're not worthy of care, you're not worthy of protection. And naming that, I think, validated for a lot of the participants what they were already experiencing, and then that allowed us to have different types of conversations. So I did want to address that, because I know I'm assuming that you're probably like an academic as well, and there's always that challenge of trying to collect data in ways that are not harmful, but, and how to do that. And that was something that we really did sit with. So I just wanted to maybe speak to that question.
Milena, I saw you put your hand up earlier.
Yes, but I was just going to also mention, points to quantitative data to measure the rebound effect that is in Deborah's question in the chat. Maybe just to emphasize that across Canada, the data that we have on energy is quite poor. Unfortunately, the concept of energy poverty, when it was first ideated in the 1990s in England, it was how much should a household need to spend in order to meet their energy needs. So there was a cross between energy consumption and how much it costs. And in Canada, unless we are able to arrive at partnership with utilities who might be willing to share this information, we cannot compute this measure of energy poverty. So it's all based on, self-reports of people, or using a threshold of how much of a household income goes to energy. So there's, StatScan households in the environment survey that has information on energy consumption, but there's no information on cost. There's the survey of household spending that has information on how much is spent on energy, but not on energy consumption. Right. So it's very difficult to have, to arrive at how much should people spend to be warm or to be cool in the summer. It also means that for renters, for whom utility bills are included in their rent, we have missing data. So we are, with any of our estimates, we might be estimates that are related to energy burden. We might be underestimating the prevalence of energy precarity across the country. And then, working with engineers and architects, there's a lot of modeling that happens around energy and energy consumption in a duplex, for example. And they're all based on guidelines around temperature, around energy use, but they don't account for specific needs and behaviors of household members. Right? So if, there's an older person or someone dealing with a chronic issue that requires increased temperature or lower temperature in the summer. So, this doesn't exist in energy model. So the modeled energy and the actual energy use from what I've seen, and I haven't seen everything, there's quite often a disconnect though. So there are lots of issues around data in paying attention to these issues.
Well, I did my research in the US, so it's also a different world now than that was then. But in terms of, I think I would prefer to, just because the data collection in my case was a bit difficult because as there was a lot of informality, as Evelyn was mentioning right in there was not that much data or surveys that have been applied, so I decided to go fully qualitative. The issue I'm facing now is Lina knows about it, right? That I'm a bit afraid that all the information, all the descriptions I put there on communities that have actually many of them are not U.S. citizens may in the long term cause some problems. So that's why my dissertation is still under embargo. I haven't published until I can be very sure what can I publish and what not. Like you can locate people. Well, of course, I anonymize as much as possible, but things today work differently, and the analysis of data works differently. I just want to make that point, on the problems I had to get data, because people was very generous with their lived experience, with what they do, with how they think. And now I'm just struggling with that. I just want to quickly mention and refer to the climate apartheid concept, which I find very interesting. Thank you so much for suggesting the book of Ashley Dawson. It's more closely related, right, with those sins of omission that I talk about, right? That is the places that do not get protection because they are not deserving. If you like the analysis of Schneider and Ingram on who's deserving and who's not is pretty useful in this case. But there's more than an apartheid, more than an isolation of a community. We also have to think about the fragmentation and how these actions, right, that are actually not caring for everyone can start fragmenting communities, like in the case of East Boston, in which not everybody in the Latinx community will live at the same time. But some will start leaving earlier, and they do not go to another Latinx community or other community that understands the world like them. They go to a community that they are just arrived, and their community is fragmented, their activism is fragmented, all the power and the knowledge they have been building is fragmented, and all the way they had to solve problems, to take advantage of opportunities, now it's also fragmented because you lose key assets of your community. So I would like to, I'm very curious, I'm going to take a look at that book, and I would like to see, right, how is that they treat that apartheid, which is a trendy word these days, and also trying to see if the community fragmentation is also contained.
I wanted to actually speak to that just a bit in terms of I haven't read the book either, but that question around apartheid, and then this connecting it to like urban planning and housing in Ontario. And one of the things that we were trying to deal with is this question of like housing as a commodity versus housing as a human right. And obviously, housing has become a commodity. It's not a human right anymore. It's more about how does housing, where you live, the conditions you live, and like your access to meaningful housing has to do with your humanity. It's more about like capital again, and not necessarily about like housing as a human right. And so when I think about that in relation to the question of like that apartheid, again, it is like apartheid is about who's deserving, who deserves and who doesn't deserve. And so when we think about housing, I think we're far past that place of trying to put forth housing as a human right. And maybe this is where the multidisciplinary comes in again, where all of these things are human rights that we're talking about, but we're not talking about them as such anymore, right? Like it's about how can I make profit off of this housing place? How can I save money as a landlord? How can I do X, Y, and Z? And so if we're unable to actually make the case, I think, around like housing as a human right and maybe even getting us back to that place of centering that, then it also makes up the question of solution a little bit impossible, because the human right aspects of housing, if housing stays a commodity, then it's about its scarceness. Scarceness is important to it. Being able to, when I was in housing again, when they were trying to do all of their redevelopment and gentrification in some of these areas, you had people who lived in the condos. So there was one particular incident where the condos looked like some of the social housing buildings. And you had people in the condo saying, like, how are people going to know I live in the condo if it looks like the social housing thing, right? So they adamantly didn't want that. It doesn't matter that they have a mortgage, they're building equity, all of that stuff. That doesn't matter, but it just looks like the social housing, and that is unfair to me as somebody who owns this condo. And so again, if we're all like attached to housing as this commodity, then it does actually sort of like shift. It makes it hard to be able to sort of like, I think, tackle this apartheid that's happening, because my housing only is important if you don't have housing, or I become important based off of where I live because you don't have a nice place like I do, and sort of like that kind of thinking that comes along with it.
And just sort of reacting to that, and just because we're going to run out of time very quickly, so in kind of a bit of chair's prerogative, if you will allow me, I just want to put out there a provocation and hear any reactions from our panel. We're talking a lot about sort of the most vulnerable side of a spectrum of people, and I wonder if our efforts in terms of, and this perhaps talks a little bit to Niku's question on how do you democratize these things. Should our research also be focusing on the other side of the spectrum, let's say on an income distribution? Should we be talking about the top 1%? Should we be talking about the top 10% in terms of actual barriers to solving these issues, right? And it relates to what you were saying, Evelyn. If these sorts of inequalities become such important barriers in all sorts of ways, then should redistribution, should limiting inequalities be a core part of our research, as well as working with these very vulnerable communities? So I'm just wondering your reactions to that. Yes, go for it.
So I agree. We need to look at the whole income distribution and at income inequality. There's a concept around energy extravagance. When I think about, single detached family houses with multiple cars that are either using gas or they are EVs, right? These cars are usually much larger than what they need to be, consume more energy. There's a heated pool often, sometimes even a jacuzzi, right? So why, in Quebec, for example, where our electricity is the lowest, the electricity tariffs are the lowest across the country at about 6 cents per kilowatt hour, right? So it doesn't matter if you are, boarding off all rooms in your apartment. You're only staying in your bedroom. You're showering at a community center because you do not want to use the hot water at home because it's too expensive. So this person and the person that I just described are paying the same amount for energy. Yes, energy bills are going to be higher for the person with multiple cars in the pool, but there's we should be able to increase the rate of energy when it goes beyond a certain level, paying attention to who is in the household and who, what the specific energy needs might be, right? So to answer your question, Lena, yes, I think we should definitely look at the other extremes or extreme of the income distribution.
And I think even beyond just looking at that, it's good to keep the tension, It's good to keep the tension on this issue because it's really easy for people not only to overlook it, but also to start justifying inequality. The example, in the country where I live in Chile, 2016, 17, 18, it started becoming also a trend for some people to be justified and say, inequality is not that bad. Look, Chile does not done that bad in terms of development compared to other countries in the region, and this discourse started permeating a lot of people that was getting their education. In 2019, the country exploded of rage against injustice. Since then, you don't hear anymore that argument. It's because people could experience, right, and could get informed on how inequality has this effect in most dimensions of life, that at the end we all, also those of us who are not at the at the bottom of the marginalized or among the most marginalized, but work to support them, we are also worse off because of this inequality existing.
Yeah. If I can add quickly, I remember when we started off doing the workshops and we got to the area of thinking about solutions. And so we talked to the group, and it was a group of students, actually York University students, and there was a provocation of, should we be putting a cap on how many housing units somebody can own, or how much money somebody can make, et cetera. And all of the participants were like, no, we shouldn't put caps on these things, right? And I think part of what's happening is that the solution that's offered to many of us, even those of us that grow up poor, grow up precarious, is that if we make enough money, these problems will no longer apply to us anymore. And so our intervention is not necessarily that we solve the problem. We just want to make sure the problem no longer impacts us, right? And for a lot of us, like I grew up poor, and my mom was always like, go to school and get a good job so you're no longer poor. It wasn't so you can figure out problems so that nobody is experiencing these things. And so for me, I find that, yeah, we do have to look at the other side, because for a lot of us, we think we're going to get there one day. And so that's our solution. Our solution is just to get to the top so that we don't have these problems anymore. And so as long as we all have that belief, while we also know it's never going to happen, but as long as we have that belief, even if it won't happen for me, I have that hope for my child or something, right? Like I have that hope for other people. And so how do I position this child to make as much money or to get this education or to do this so that they don't have the same problems that I face, versus the question of how do we just like kind of solve these problems so that we're not all dealing with them anymore, I think becomes so important. So we do have to have that conversation, because the more, and I think it's really coming to life these days, like exposing, just the billionaire class or the top 1% and just how not well they are. And more people, I think, are grappling with that. And so maybe there's an opportunity actually to do this and to maybe like shape that perception that somehow one day I'm just going to make enough money that I'm no longer going to have these problems. And it's definitely something I see with like more middle class or people who are coming into middle class as well, right? Because now you're kind of precarious, but not really, and you're making enough money that you can have some of the nice stuff and not have these problems, but you're also not necessarily all the way there. And there's this like, so what is that role of that middle class as well, just to your question? Like maybe it's not just the top, but it's also like that middle class as well, and really having, being intentional about bringing them into the conversation as well.
Okay, well, I just want to really thank everyone in the panel, especially for agreeing to come and have this discussion with each other and with us, and to all the attendants here in person and online. The recording of today will be available on the Data Lake Institute's website. There's also going to be a recap written by Lauren, who's joined us here today. So once those resources are out, please feel free to share with other people you think might be interested but couldn't make it today. And have a great weekend ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Lena. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Bye.
Patricia. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.